The wife, now completely isolated, began to face the harsh truth of her situation. She had burned bridges with everyone who once mattered, and with each passing day, the reality of her loneliness settled deeper. The life she had once known, filled with admiration, comfort, and the illusion of control, was gone. Her attempts at reconciliation were now met with pity, not sympathy. Her reputation was beyond repair, and the guilt gnawed at her. Meanwhile, the husband's life flourished. He had rebuilt his sense of self-worth, no longer defined by his marriage. He enjoyed his independence, thriving at work and slowly, cautiously, entering new relationships. Those around him admired his strength and maturity, impressed by how he had handled everything with such dignity. The wife's sense of defeat deepened when she saw him living happily without her. She realized too late that his quiet strength had been the ultimate form of revenge, the simple act of moving on, leaving her to wallow in the consequences of her own choices. The husband, who had once been hurt, was now free, and she could do nothing but watch as he reclaimed his life. While she was left behind in her own regrets, months went by, and the wife's bitterness only grew. She had tried to rebuild some semblance of a life, but every effort felt hollow. She attended therapy, hoping to heal, but the reality of her actions was always in the back of her mind. No matter how much she tried to distract herself with work or new relationships, the weight of her betrayal followed her. One day, while scrolling through social media, she stumbled upon a post from her ex-husband. It was a picture of him smiling with friends at a gathering, genuine, happy, and surrounded by the kind of people who cared about him. In the caption, he mentioned how he had finally found peace after the storm. The wife couldn't help but feel the sharp sting of regret. That was when she realized just how thoroughly he had healed, while she remained stuck in the past, still consumed by her mistakes. Her former lover, who she had once relied on for validation, had also moved on. He'd started a relationship with someone new, someone who didn't carry the baggage she had brought into their affair. The wife's world felt smaller and smaller, each day reminding her of the life she could have had if she hadn't sabotaged everything out of selfishness. In a final moment of clarity, the wife understood that her ex-husband's true revenge wasn't the humiliation she had once feared. It was simply that he had grown, moved on, and rebuilt himself into a better person. The more she wallowed in self-pity, the more she realized that he had already won. His strength and resilience, his ability to move forward without her, was the greatest victory of all. And in that moment, the wife knew she would never be able to undo the damage she had caused. The silence, the calm, the absence of her in his life. It was the most powerful form of revenge she would ever face. As the years went by, the wife's life became a cycle of fleeting attempts at happiness, always overshadowed by the looming reality of her past. She never found lasting peace, constantly haunted by the decisions that led to her downfall. Her career, while stable, lacked the fulfillment she had once dreamed of. Her relationships, too, felt shallow as she struggled to connect with others on a deeper level, weighed down by her own guilt. Meanwhile, her ex-husband continued to thrive. He had built a new life, one that was rich with meaningful connections, both professional and personal. He had learned to trust again and eventually entered a healthy relationship with someone who respected and valued him. It was clear to everyone who knew him that he had become a better version of himself. He had transformed his pain into strength and wisdom, and he carried on, unburdened by the past. The wife would occasionally hear about him through mutual acquaintances, and though it stung each time, it also served as a reminder of the price she had paid for her actions. She had thought that her affair and manipulation would give her the satisfaction she craved, but in the end, it had only cost her everything: her marriage, her reputation, and her sense of self. On one particularly quiet evening, after another failed attempt at making amends with someone from her past, she sat alone, reflecting on everything that had transpired. Her ex-husband's final act of revenge wasn't anything dramatic. It wasn't the public humiliation or the revenge-filled tirade she had feared. It was far simpler and far more devastating. He had moved on with his life while she remained trapped in hers, a prisoner of her own mistakes. In that moment, The wife understood the true cost of betrayal, and with that knowledge came a deep and irreversible sense of loss. She realized that no matter how much time passed, her ex-husband had already won. Not by making her suffer, but by allowing her to face the consequences of her choices, all while he moved forward into a brighter future without her. And it was then that she knew, with painful clarity, that the past was a place she could never return to, and the person she used to be was gone forever. Years passed, and the wife's life remained a constant reminder of her mistakes. Despite her efforts to move on, she couldn't escape the weight of her betrayal. Her career felt hollow, and her personal relationships lacked depth. She often heard about her ex-husband's continued success, his new life full of happiness and peace, which only deepened her regret. He had truly won, not through revenge, but by moving on, leaving her behind to face the consequences of her choices. The silence, the absence of him in her life, was the harshest punishment of all. She realized that the greatest victory he had was simply living well without her. And no matter how much time passed, she knew she could never undo the damage she had caused as time wore on. The wife's regret deepened. She watched from a distance as her ex-husband's life flourished, filled with happiness, purpose, and genuine love. Meanwhile, she remained stuck, unable to shake the consequences of her betrayal. Her own life was marked by fleeting moments of fleeting happiness, but nothing lasting. The weight of what she had lost, the trust, the love, and the future they could have had, was something she could never regain. In the end, she understood that her ex-husband's true revenge was simply to live well without her, while she was left to grapple with the irreparable damage she had caused.
A cheating wife, who had been hiding her affair for months, believed she could manipulate and humiliate her husband without facing consequences. She had been meeting her lover behind his back, all while pretending everything was fine at home. When her husband, who had begun to suspect her behavior, finally confronted her, she tried to dismiss his concerns by accusing him of being paranoid. Rather than react emotionally, the husband decided to take a different approach. He didn't explode in anger or make any dramatic scenes. Instead, he calmly recorded every conversation they had from that point on, even capturing her interactions with her lover during their heated exchanges. He also began to subtly alter his behavior to make her believe he was completely unaware of her betrayal, playing the role of the oblivious husband who was too trusting. As time passed, he began quietly gathering evidence of her affair, all while pretending everything was normal. Eventually, after months of careful planning, he presented her with undeniable proof of her infidelity, including a detailed account of all her lies and the time she had tried to humiliate him. To make his point even clearer, he shared this evidence with her lover, exposing everything. The wife, now fully aware that her actions had been exposed, tried to salvage her image, but the husband had already ensured that the humiliation was hers to bear. The man didn't need to raise his voice or make accusations. His methodical approach and calm demeanor made her realize that sometimes silence can be the most effective form of revenge. The husband reclaimed control of his life, having not only exposed her infidelity but also turned the tables on her in a way she never saw coming. As the days passed after the confrontation, the wife was left in a state of shock. She had assumed her husband was too naive to catch on to her lies, but now every corner of her deceit had been exposed. The husband's calm demeanor had thrown her off guard, making it all the more humiliating when he shared the recorded evidence of her betrayal with her friends and family. Her lover, who had been just as smug about the affair, also began to distance himself from her. The husband's quiet but powerful actions had effectively removed any sense of security the wife had in her illicit relationship. The affair had never been more public, and soon, the gossip in their social circle became unavoidable. For the wife, this was a slow burn of humiliation. She lost her reputation among those who once looked up to her, as her friends and even family began to question her integrity. Her attempts to save face were futile. In the meantime, the husband remained composed, focusing on his own life and moving forward with dignity. In a final twist of poetic justice, the wife, who once thought she could control the narrative, found herself scrambling to reclaim her dignity, while the husband had already moved on, stronger and wiser from the experience. He didn't need to play the role of the victim. His response had already shown his true strength. He had taken revenge not with anger, but with a calculated, silent confidence that left her feeling smaller and more powerless than she ever could have imagined. Eventually, the wife realized that it wasn't the affair or even the public exposure that had hurt her the most. It was the fact that her husband had moved on with his life, showing that he no longer needed her to be whole. The tables had turned as weeks went by. The wife continued to spiral, grappling with the fallout from her actions. She tried to salvage her marriage by apologizing to her husband, but the damage was already done. The husband's indifference to her apologies only deepened her sense of loss. He had no desire to reconcile, not because of bitterness, but because he realized he deserved better. He had already emotionally detached from her. His trust shattered beyond repair. Meanwhile, the husband was thriving. His friends rallied around him, impressed by how he had handled the entire situation with grace and strength. He had begun focusing on his personal goals, taking up new hobbies, working harder on his career, and even dating again, though he was careful not to rush into anything. The support he received from his circle of friends and family reinforced his belief that he was better off without someone who had disrespected him so thoroughly. The wife, now abandoned by both her lover and the people who once supported her, found herself isolated. Her attempts to get back into the social circles she had once dominated were met with cold stares and whispered conversations. Her reputation, once built on a facade of perfection, was irreparably damaged. Her lover, once so eager to indulge in their secret affair, had moved on to someone else. He had grown tired of the drama she brought into his life, and without the thrill of secrecy, he saw no reason to stay. But the real sting came when the wife was confronted by a mutual friend, someone who had once been close to both her and her husband. This friend told her in no uncertain terms that the husband had already forgiven her, not because he cared to rebuild their relationship, but because he understood that she was too broken to be worth his time. The friend, in an almost poetic sense, said that the husband had chosen to rise above her, while she remained stuck in the past, trying to salvage a life that had long since crumbled. For the first time, the wife realized that it wasn't just the affair or the consequences of her actions that had destroyed her. It was the realization that her husband had outgrown her. He had found peace, while she had only found chaos. His revenge wasn't in the form of public humiliation or grand gestures. It was in his ability to walk away with dignity and move forward with his life while she remained trapped in the wreckage of her own choices. The wife finally understood the true power of her husband's quiet revenge. He had humiliated her in the only way that really mattered, by showing her that she was no longer the center of his world. As time passed, the wife's life continued to unravel. Her attempts to mend things with her husband fell flat, as he remained distant, focused on his own growth. The husband, having gained back his peace, watched from afar as she struggled to regain any semblance of control over her life. Her social circles had turned their backs on her, and even her lover, once so invested, had abandoned her. The wife, left with nothing but her own regret, finally realized the depth of her loss. Not just the marriage, but the respect and security she had once taken for granted. The husband, having quietly moved on, found happiness again. His revenge was never about drama or confrontation. It was simply about living his life, thriving without her, and leaving her to face the consequences of her actions alone.